the attacks will come. The attacks will come in many forms. They'll come in your dreams.
Meditate on this. God isolated you because he wants you to build his temple.
This year and every year, I set a very strong intention, come around the period ending December, starting January, to develop a stronger relationship with God. And I wanted to kind of take the time to talk about how you are isolated or feel isolated, and how this feeling is usually attributed to a higher purpose of building God's temple. When you build your temple, you build God's temple. You allow yourself to be used almost like a conduit for divine intention. And how we can mitigate the presence of satanic and devil energy in our lives via drifting. Napoleon Hill mentioned this word drifting in the book Outwitting the Devil, and how we can start to allocate better assets in relation to this drifting mechanism and back into building God's temple, allowing our hands to be used for a greater purpose in this respect. So if this is our energy, our attention, and our bandwidth at 100%, your RAM, as it were, in terms of attention, here we have on the left-hand side some of the mechanisms that I am currently employing in order to start to build my personal temple and allow God's kind of energy to move through me and build that purpose. So the first one is acknowledging spiritual health in this respect. And I personally interpret spiritual health as this actualizing of the immutable soul, or the immortal soul, that beneath all the maya, the illusion, we are just one collective consciousness. That might be a better word for those less spiritually inclined than me and others. This idea that we are all seeking to come and unite universal consciousness beneath the facade of the human ego. Some of the systems that I have therefore been employing for many, many years now, and perhaps trying to do better in some areas, are certainly fasting. Fasting for me has never been a huge barrier or huge point of resistance for me. And a lot of people ask the question, why is there continuity in fasting across multiple different religions, be it Hinduism, be it Islam, be it Buddhism, be it even Christianity as well. You're talking about Jesus fasting 40 days in the desert, and that is in order to seek and move past the carnal impulses of the body and seek the immutable soul that sits beneath that. And in the same way, I talk a lot about this idea of abstinence, celibacy, and controlling that carnal nature, the animalistic impulse within you. It is all in order to find and unite ourselves with that universal collective consciousness, that presence, that soul, that pneuma, that Atman, that whatever you want to call it, which is the most important thing. And the reason I have perhaps such a zealous and passionate opinion on the mitigation of carnality in modern Western man is because it's so pervasive, and because I believe it's the antidote to a lot of the modern neurosis that we are experiencing in not just 2023, but into the future now. And I believe the antidote is found in a collective ideal that is higher than individual selfishness and individuality. We have to unite and align ourselves in morals and values that are more consistent with a common myth or religion, and transcend that and get to the truth of the immortal and immutable soul. Another mechanism that I'm trying to do better in is reading the Word of God. And for those of you that keep asking me, Joseph, when are you going to become Muslim? When are you going to become, a follower of Christ? I don't believe that there is one particular road to God. I believe there are many different roads to God. I think religion, and you need to be careful, can be a path into ideology and dogma, and that is a human ego, and that is a limitation, and in fact brings you further away from God. I've actually met pastors, and I've met people who don't subscribe to any particular religion, who in my opinion are more spiritual than pastors. That's because they're not preaching dogma, they're not preaching it's my road to God and the only way to God. I believe individuals who are seeking that will find and know different paths in order to come to a greater understanding to the end goal. And if you find solace in the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, I wouldn't technically classify as scripture, but it has some amazing philosophical insights that bring you closer to the actualization of God. I put it upon myself to start reading a little bit more in detail the Holy Bible, especially some of the Gospels, the Upanishads, the Quran and the Tao Te Ching, which I believe perhaps gets as close as you can to this idea of God, purely because the Tao Te Ching is more poetry, and it's more about the feeling and the presence behind the words and what frame of consciousness it places you in. But, similarly, we're not here to compare these different roads to God. I believe that you can find God in all of these particular scriptures, and perhaps you have more of affinity for others than the next person. For example, I have a great affinity for the sutras and the Gita, the Upanishads as well, the Tao Te Ching. And, I'm certainly open and receptive to, I have a Quran, the Quran, and again, very receptive to finding God in those texts. And people have before, and I'm sure I will as well. But let me know what you guys are reading at the moment in relation to these scriptures. And again, if you're religious, that's fine, that's great. I have the utmost respect for individuals that have sought to be on a particular road and chosen that road to find God. That's fine. I think, though, I would, not have you be dogmatic and be sensitive towards the other roads that can lead to that destination, because God doesn't just belong to you. Presence is actually where you find God the most, in my personal opinion. So presence, there are variations of different, I've kind of put the kind of classé and cliche and perhaps trite examples here, but even beyond that, I believe you can find it in music. When you're playing music and you're really going into that flow state, you can find God when you're going through a peaceful walk in a meadow or along the beach, which I do quite often here in the UK, the south coast of England. You find God in the sea, you find God in the sand, you find God in the air, you find God in the sky. And it's being present and not having your consciousness divided, which I believe actually takes you away from God and leaves you into drifting. What you actually note in the drifting mechanism, which we'll come to soon, is God is found in the collecting of consciousness. And the collecting of consciousness, you have these real spiritual insights when you pray, when you meditate, when you walk, when you do Qigong or Tai Chi, things like that, because they unify consciousness. But you move away from God, you drift from God, you descend into hell when you divide consciousness. And you can, I'll allude to some in just a moment, but there are going to be some usual culprits there in which divide your attention and therefore take you away from the presence of God. Now, I've mentioned spiritual business pursuits here next to the spiritual pursuits, and I believe that sharing the truth of the immortal soul comes into what you're doing when you're building a business. And I know that might sound very, very strange, but hold on to that idea for just a moment. So the sharing the truth of the immortal soul, when I'm doing these videos, when I'm posting on the X platform, you have to recognize that God is in the work that you are fundamentally doing. I've taken a quote here from Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita when he's talking to Arjuna about recognizing the immortal soul, the immutable soul. And I just wanted to read this for you here. And one of the reasons, again, why I have such an affinity for Hindu and Eastern texts. You have the right to the work, but for the work's sake only. This is God speaking. You have no rights to the fruit of the work. Desire for the fruits of the work must never be your motive in working. Never give way to laziness either. What's very interesting about the conversation and dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna is there's multiple different ways you can read it from. There's also a really interesting way, and one of the best ways I like to read it from is, this is Arjuna, who's the protagonist of the Bhagavad Gita. Well, some people would say Krishna, but it's Arjuna speaking to his higher self, to his soul. So he's having a conversation with himself, with his ideal self, with the version that he'd like to be. And he's kind of imbibing what he would like the highest version of himself to tell him in recognition of this pursuit of work in life, in building businesses, because some people have such a tenuous relationship with work and finances and money and survival comparatively to, no, I should be seeking God. But you find God in the work as long as you're not attached to the outcome. Perform every action with your heart fixed on the Supreme Lord. Renounce attachment to the fruits. Be even tempered in success and failure, for it is the evenness of temper which is meant by yoga. So perform every action with your heart fixed on the Supreme Lord. And I'm sure there's some crossover with this idea. I'm probably misquoting here, but I believe there's a passage by Jesus Christ when he's talking about when you're doing things in memory of me, then you're finding God. When you're doing things with your heart and your mind, seeking God, that intention, you're finding him, and you're reducing your karmic debt. Work done with anxiety about results is far inferior to work done without such anxiety. In the calmness of self-surrender, seek refuge in the knowledge of Brahma. They who work selfishly for results are miserable. And what I love is, I was going to do a video about the magic of intention, how the sentiment behind what you're doing something is almost like a magic spell. And it's doubled down in here. When you're working in anxiety, when you're working like, oh, I have to get this video posted, I have to meet this deadline, I have to do this because otherwise I won't get what I want, you're actually getting away from the point of what you're doing. You should be doing what you're doing in a act of in service. Like you're letting yourself become a conduit for God, and God is moving through you, and you have the right to that work. It's, no, I get to create a video. No, I get to create some interesting content here that I believe can move people in the direction of self-actualization. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're a copywriter, or if you work in e-commerce, or you're an email marketer. God is in the work that you're doing. You don't have the right to the financial benefits of what you're doing if you're not enjoying the fruits of your labor. God is found in the work. It's like chasing the horizon. It's like chasing the sunset. You never get there. Physical and mental health I see as a celebration of the body and a celebration of God. So part of my, I suppose, focal point in this year in respects to my physical fitness, I find in bodybuilding. And I see that again as a celebration of the body in the different movement patterns, in the strength, in the stretching, in the nutrition, and the mobility of what my body can do. I think for me, the personal karma I have in relation to that is I do a lot of work, or have done a lot of work in the past, pardon me, with individuals who are disabled, who have been born with tumors, who can't use their arms and legs properly. And I see it as such an act of allowing God to move through me to celebrate my body. I guess that's the easiest way to put it. And again, it doesn't really matter what you do as long as you recognize there are individuals out there who are not born with the gifts that you have, and to not use them, to become gluttonous, to become lethargic and apathetic is an act of drifting. I recognize that perhaps bodybuilding can come from a place of ego as well. But again, it's the intention you're using when you're doing that thing. If you can do bodybuilding, if you can go through a tricep extension and be present, be there, enjoying the work, the contraction of the muscle, and how good that feels, and the fact that you can do this and you can grow and you can develop it and you can make your body beautiful. I see that as coming from an intention of, again, recognizing the soul, especially when you're making it a meditation and you're not distracted by music and again what you're going to look like eventually. But if you can just be there and fall in love with the work, I believe you can mitigate the sin of pride. Healthy social activities, as well as finding God in people for me. I'm trying to find and collect a group of people who celebrate purpose and not pleasure, and in that might be a celebration of the body. Cold water swims is something I've been doing for many weeks now, many months now, I should say, probably about a year now. Indoor climbing, golf, five-a-side football, breathwork, and yoga. And when you're, especially in the latter point, finding individuals who celebrate purpose and not pleasure, I believe you accelerate your, the weight of your karmic debt, and you become closer and closer to actualizing what you are, and that is the pneuma, that is the breath within the breath. If you're finding that your company that you're keeping is more concerned about how much, debauchery, how much pleasure they can reap and squeeze out of a single moment instead of just being there now and being grateful for it, then perhaps that is a barrier. Perhaps that is a barrier to you actually actualizing God's temple and the greatest version of yourself. Equally, I see all these mediums for collecting knowledge as a conduit to find truth, to find God in, the books that you're reading, the blogs that you're reading, the lectures that you're listening to as well. So, this fervent point here is really about how much attention and energy are you going to spend this year into building God's temple and actualizing yourself as the pneuma. And where can you find opportunities to mitigate drifting? Pleasure poisons your purpose. It takes you away from recognizing the truth of what you are. It makes you identified with your body. And you're not your body. You have a body. The body is beautiful. But it can also be a crutch. It can also be something that attaches you to the world. And you want to be detached. It's not that I'm against pleasure. It's that I'm against attachment to pleasure. And the way that you become detached is that nothing owns you. It's not that you don't own anything. Enlightenment isn't that, you don't have maybe things that you enjoy in your life, maybe a nice car, maybe good food, maybe good company, maybe, material possessions. It just means that the material possessions don't own you, that if I took them away, that you would have no emotional, perhaps, attachment and get reactive to it. And that's the difference there, and a key difference. You don't have to live like an ascetic, but you can't be emotionally and ideologically and identity bound to these things. They can't lessen you with their presence and without it. You must stay the same, with or without them. Video games, big one for me, and perhaps still can be a bad habit that I fall into drifting and recognizing again I'm falling back into something where my whole day is orientated around the pleasure that I'm going to experience, the rewards that I'm going to get. It's another form of attachment. It's another form of drifting. It's another form of taking you away from what you recognize you fundamentally are. Fast food, social media, I would call that validation. I would call that pride. I would call that ego. All you need to do is look on Instagram, TikTok, and all these other platforms and recognize they're more of a medium for gratifying one's appearance, especially Instagram, things like that. And it's another form of drifting. It's another form of coming into some kind of hell. I don't believe hell is a physical place. I believe it's a mental place. I believe it's a spiritual place. And I've been there. I've been there. When you move out of these places, again, the devil entity, the agents of Satan will have more of a reasoning and a rationale to pursue you, because you're starting to transcend the scale of consciousness. You're moving into courage. You're moving past pride. You're moving into willingness, acceptance, enlightenment. And the attacks will come. The attacks will come in many forms. They'll come in your dreams. They'll come in individuals who test you that you are actually on the path of building God's temple, and it's not fraught, without those particular attacks. And it is ever more fulfilling when you take those lessons, you pass those tests, and you begin to continue to lay brick after brick until the temple is almost there. Another form of gluttony in the form of mental consumption, of course, Netflix, of course, Disney, of course, YouTube for me, personal poison that I need to find the space to mitigate the drifting here. So looking at this particular mind map, guys, I'm interested to see how much of your bandwidth you are going to allocate into which area here. And hopefully by the end of the year, we can find ourselves more leaning into the building of God's work, using ourselves as a conduit to achieve what He would like us to achieve this year. And I have a good feeling about 2024. And these aren't theories, they're facts. Speak soon.